had a history of sleep apnea but has had her tonsils removed, and that actually has improved her sleep. You wouldn't know from the example I gave you, right? All right, so then we really did have a picture of Annie in the pool because swimming is one of her favorite activities, but we also put in some of the other things that Annie liked to do so that people knowing Annie did not see the limitations first, but really saw what her skills were. And these are directly verbatim taken from her behavior plan of what the team and her parents have decided are her strengths. All right, then this becomes a little reminder to staff, okay? All behavior has meaning. It's just our job to figure that out. This is also that Annie is just like any other kid. She wants to move, she wants to explore, and she wants to learn. We also thought that there was a way that there was some definitions that we weren't sure that all the individuals working with Annie would know. So we threw a picture of the team up there and we said, here are some of the jargon my staff tend to use. And so we gave them the definition of arousal. I'm not going to give you all these. We're going to go through this quicker. Self-regulation. And then Annie likes to explore the world through her senses. And her OT and her PT were really good at using all of these big words instead of just saying she smells, she tastes, she touches. So we wanted to make sure that staff had these definitions. And we actually did have a picture of Annie with cake all over her face rather than the image that you have here. All right, so then we wanted to tell people what sensory integration was all about within one slide. And then we wanted to talk about the fact that Annie has behaviors that are all the way on both sides of the behavior continuum. She's compliant at times, she's non-compliant. She's attentive, she's not attentive. She's affectionate, and she's aggressive. All of those. So you'll notice that the next couple of slides, when she's happy, when she's sad, when she's tired, or when she's frustrated, are all the exact same list of behaviors. We wanted people to know that her behavior could change when you push her to use her language and she doesn't have the skills. It's a skill issue. When you ask her to sit for a long time, she has a very short attention span. When she can't get her message across, she becomes frustrated. When she wants her attention from you and you're not giving it to her. When she's tired, we've already talked about that one. Hurt or sick or unexpected changes in her schedule. Now, we wanted to acknowledge her mom because her mom ended up taking the same PowerPoint presentation and sharing it with the baseball coach, sharing it with the swim coach, sharing it with her outside therapist. We had a parent who was very motivated to make sure that everybody working with this kid understood it. So we wanted to make sure that mom's concerns made it to this. And what mom's concerns were is that we not label her just because of her Down syndrome, but mom really had a feeling that there was a lot more going on. And so the puzzle really became her cognitive abilities, her motor abilities, her communication abilities, and the one that mom focused in on a lot was her sensory regulation. And so we wanted to make sure that staff knew that all of those things existed. One of her therapists introduced mom to the book, How Does Your Engine Run? And mom really liked that analogy, and so mom pushed us to put the next couple of slides in there to explain how does your engine run and to talk about days when your engine was running fast and running slow. And so here were some of the ideas about that, and we won't get to that. And then we had characteristics of a fast day, some of the things we could do for when your engine was running fast for staff. You'll notice that in this one also, I put in a lot of transitional movement onto the PowerPoint because otherwise it is a lot of information and very boring. It's boring to begin with, but at least there's fun transitions to try to wake you up. And then the same thing we did with the slow engine times and talking about different things that staff could do with her, but we wanted to really warn them that the same thing they do one time can alert her and another time can calm her down. So if you have a slow engine day and we're slowing her down, that's not going to make sense, but what are some of the things that'll work? And so what we ended up doing is giving people permission to let her have things in her hands, let her chew on a pencil, let her fidget. That really, for Annie and for many of her classmates, that fidgeting was actually better. And it was interesting because the program supervisor who oversees this program is really good at chewing off the little stems on her pen. And so she understood the idea that maybe it wasn't just Annie that needed to chew. It was sort of funny because in the meeting, you know, we're looking at this very chewed up pencil. All right, so we wanted to give people the opportunity to have some flexibility. Just like a mechanic, you need to make little changes. They had already gone through training that talked about the fact that we needed to be looking at measurable behavior that were specific, meaningful, achievable, reliable, and timely. So this was a review slide for most of them. And then we got into, this is verbatim off of her standard behavior plan. So we talked about what would actually happen. We did use a visual timer a lot for her to help her. And we also decided that we would not isolate her, but we would give her a way out. So in every case, wherever she was sitting, whether it was circle time, whether she was sitting at a desk, she would only have a peer to one side of her. Because we found that putting peers on both sides of her were definitely a trigger. We would definitely have the problems. But at the same time, we didn't want to have her way over in the corner. We wanted her to learn. I mean, one of the replacement behaviors we were hoping for is that social interaction. So it goes through all of these different strategies. And then at some point, the staff said, how does that really look on a real day? So we added these additional slides later to tell people what a typical day actually looked like for her, using her schedule, what we would expect people to do. And so we took it step by step. But initially, the presentation, the PowerPoint ended in that last slide. Here's a picture of her actual talker. You'll see that not all the buttons at this point have been filled in. We were gradually adding to it. So we were all very excited as a staff, and everyone was like, let's put that one in, let's put that one in. Slowly, slowly. So we were taking things that later would actually move into a more complex, and in fact, right now, she's actually using something that she can change the templates for. She's using a little bit more of a complex talker. Notice the very first one. Every staff is told to make sure they check that message from home, because we know that if we don't know what went on the night before, we are at a loss. It's us without the paddle upstream. Okay, here's a picture of her actual schedule. You'll see that she carried with her all of the items in this envelope. So it was just a little envelope with Velcro on one side. You'll notice that the example that I have there are really two math examples. It's like math part A, take a break, that's a timer picture in between, then math part B. But if we put the same symbol, she wasn't very cooperative with that. So math, reading, some of the other activities had multiple pictures we grew into so that she could take a break that was scheduled and then come back to it. So here was the routine that we had staff actually using, and when to do the sensory break, how to use her schedule, making sure that she had choices. And then Mom had acquired more stuff at home that was for her sensory. So Mom brought most of it, except we didn't end up using the large balls. They were really used whenever she was with physical therapy only. But the rest of it, the squeezy ball, the little brushes, the things to chew on, were all part of her sensory locker, including a timer. Because initially we'd set that timer for 1 minute and check if that was enough of a break. Oftentimes, the leaving the room, stamping out of the room, jumping up and down, getting to her locker and doing this for just a minute or so was enough to bring her back. There were other days that we had to check and monitor whether she was ready to come back to school. The last thing that became really obvious, and this was only obvious after Mom took her to see either Disney on Ice or Dora on Ice, Annie really did not do well in assemblies or large things, so after spending $30-some on tickets, Mom learned this. And we wanted to make sure that we gave Annie outs. That it was written in, it was later an addendum to her behavior plan that she did not have to go to all school assemblies, that just was going to be a behavior meltdown, and whoever the guest speaker was or whoever was there performing was going to get interrupted by Annie. So it was probably better that we didn't bring Annie in. And so Mom and Dad were okay with this, and we actually, the other thing that would happen is that Annie would break down and actually could not hold herself and would urinate on herself when all sensory systems broke down. So if we were going to have any successive school assembly, she had to go to the bathroom immediately right before that. And so we wanted to make sure that that was in there too. And that whenever we saw, she was sort of like that wolf. She did have a posture that we could tell when she would start to curl in to herself. We knew that she had already broken down, and we needed at some times, thank goodness she was a small first grader, and her aid was fairly big, to take her physically out. At that point, waiting for her to walk would not have worked. And so we actually did have a postural cue for her. Okay, then the last one was to remind people about data, data, data. We won't go there. You'll hear that enough today. Oh, this was the other one. That sometimes when you start new behavior plans, it gets worse before it gets better. And we wanted to give people that permission to know that. And then last but not least, how to get a hold of me. And the team actually did use that occasionally. In the beginning, they used it a lot. So we had learned a lot from Annie, and we now have 2 other kids that we've done not as detailed a PowerPoint on, but we've now started to do PowerPoints to have for the substitute teacher, for the new people that come in and out, for the interns, for whoever. And it really does take away time, or gives me back a little of my time rather than having to train every single new person that walks in the door. They also get a copy of the slides, and they get a copy of the actual regulation, IEP, behavior plan. So they get all of that together. Questions? Who would like a break? Good, let's take a break. Page 19 of your handout. That's your own plan. Based on what you've already seen, what might be some of the things that you might want to be implementing? Rather than keeping you till 2:30 and saying, okay, right, take a minute and look at the 3 columns. What do you need for crisis prevention so that you don't burn out? What do you need to motivate yourself to be using some of this? What skills do you feel like you still need? And what do you need to set yourself up to be successful? So take a minute, start jotting it down. We're going to take a couple of times throughout our session. I promise not to make any of this public. You can decide to talk to your neighbor about it, but I won't make you actually do it. So it's the one that says your plan. Yes? Okay, clarification, go for it.
In our own personal life that we want to change, or something like if we were doing a plan on
This
somebody?
is you as a person, you as a professional, you as a family member. It can be any of those, but it is focused on what change you want to make.
Okay.
So if that new house, that new car is motivating to you, you better talk to your significant other or your financial advisor. If it's getting a bigger pay raise or looking for another job, please don't tell me that this, that I had any impact on that one. If it's skills that you need, you don't have enough recreation in your life. Maybe there's a class there waiting for you. So it can be any of those things. All right, so we are almost done with Annie. We've had a chance to review her PowerPoint. For anybody who has come in late, we are on page 10 of your handout. You'll notice that I've left places for you to take more notes. So if they're blank, they were there for a reason, so don't worry about that. Let me share with you, now that we got some consistency with Annie, this is the last thing I like to do before break, so I always wait till you're really a little more refreshed to talk about more data. All right, so the blue on these, yeah, it comes up blue there. The blue on here is non-compliant behaviors, and earlier you saw that I had defined what those were. So the blue lines over the course of the 4 months was going down. Was it perfect? No. The red lines are the disruptive behaviors as we had defined them. Those were going down significantly. Once she really got into her personal schedule and her talk box, as her other way, when she really broke down, she was typically a kid who was more verbal unless the behaviors were such. And that way the sign came up and the voice went off, or the talker came out. And so that's how that was being used. And you'll see that the disruptive behaviors took a significant drop from over 20 in the beginning to on month 3, less than 5 of them during a daily average. And then the physical aggression really almost disappeared. We had caught what was really frustrating to Annie, and we had felt as a team, looking at this data, we were most proud of the fact that she didn't have to beat herself or others up to get her needs or to tell us that she was frustrated. We felt the proudest on that one. But this one really says, okay, here's our target behaviors. What have they been reduced? That wasn't the one that was really important. Whoops, that wasn't the one that was as important to us. Here are the replacement behaviors that we had targeted, some of them. Look at how after 3 months of using a schedule, how many times she was using it. Look at what expressing her wants or asking for help was going up. Wearing her hearing aids was getting a little bit better. She wasn't using them at all in the early data, the before or at the end of month 1, and so we felt like we had really accomplished something getting her to wear those hearing aids even part of the day, because that wasn't something she did at home. And we found that certain times the hearing aids had to come out because it was too noisy, and on those sensory times we had to give her a quieter place. We almost got to the point where we were thinking of replacing headphones with the hearing aids with headphones, noise quieting kind of headphones. So that was a pretty impressive one for us on looking at Annie in that regard. The next case I want to talk about is what we have for possibility. So Emily Dickinson said, dwell in the possibility, and anything is possible. And I think that with our next case, we didn't think that anything was possible. Yeah?
Can I ask a question?
Sure, ask, sure.
What kind of data collection team did you have? How many people were doing it? How many times a day were they doing it? Was it specific, specific hours that you were collecting this, or was it across the board? How many people were involved in it, and how did you get them to do it?
Okay, I'll be happy to talk about that. Okay, the question is more about the kind of data collection, who had the responsibility for doing it. What we wanted to avoid in that situation, Mom had volunteered to come in and collect data. Okay, the team wasn't real happy with having Mom there because Mom was a variable that, just wasn't what we wanted to see. The second thing we wanted to avoid with data collection is the need to, the teacher first came up with the idea of like every minute or every 10 minutes for the entire day, and it was like this huge. So we did that little bits and pieces. We would have a form with what we told staff was that we were going to take daily averages. So it meant that we would count the number of days and we would count the number of times. When Annie was having a truly horrible meltdown day, her staff in the room was busy keeping her and the other kids occupied, and we understood that a narrative after that, at the end of that day, to explain it was okay, so that we could then go back and try to fill it in. And that happened especially month 1. All of the staff in the room had been trained, and we had sort of a rotation going on that whoever was responsible for working with Annie, recording what we did going out, taking her out into the hall, had to be that person who was working with her. We also put one of her tracking schedules on her data collection, actually on the sensory locker, and so it could be easily tallied there and it didn't have to go with. So that was a nightmare for me to actually try to figure it out, because I took on the responsibility of actually doing the graphs and the totals, because then I'd have to okay, here's this hour and here and this, and it was a time-consuming thing initially. Once we started to see that there was actually some very specific times that we needed to take data, after these 3 months, we got to a different tracking sheet. I think it was at month 2.5, in fact, a different tracking sheet and a different schedule. So initially, we knew we had to have it more intensive to really monitor if the plan was working. We had way too many variables. We had the cognitive variables, we had the communication variables. We needed the data, and the team saw that. So the who was anybody that was working with Annie. So if the speech therapist had Annie for an hour or half an hour, that person was responsible for doing it. And then we also said that you didn't have to be perfect. We gave people the option and said, please make it in real time. And if you're having a bad day, here's the note section. Just write the narrative and tell us what happened in 20 words or less. A couple of times it was such a bad day that it was too much to write, and staff would just leave a message on my voicemail. And then I had to decide how to put it all down. And I took the responsibility to be the contact person for that. And yeah, it was crazy making. By month 3, we had narrowed down. The tracking sheet initially had about 50. At the next break, I'll actually look. I might actually have it on my computer, and I could show you what the tracking sheets actually looked like. We converted them from Excel sheets. Well, initially we had them on Word or something. We put them on Excel, and then converting them over became really easy to come up with the graphs and all. Initially, the very first month, though, before we had the tracking sheets, we actually had little boxes that the teacher was, when the teacher was doing it, she would actually put a paper clip into the, and so we didn't have it by hour. So the initial part was just a tracking of how often it happened, and she had put a bunch of, and she came up with this. This is what she wanted to do: a bunch of empty paper clip boxes. So she put them in some big container and had labeled each of the boxes, and then she had a stack of paper clips, and she would just put them in to tally it, and that's how she was keeping track of it in the beginning. And then we knew which things we had to put on the form. I think that's, I might have left out a step, but I think that was the process. So, I mean, you really do need a key person, but it really was a check-in. And we scheduled 2 lunch meetings and probably 5 before school and only 1 after school meeting with the team over those 3 months to check in and see how things were going. A lot in the beginning, and one of the other cases we're going to talk about of the need to do that. But because we had the data, I could say, look, we're seeing some improvement, and let's not stop it too early. I think that's probably of the experience, is stopping the data collection or stopping the technique too early before you've really tested out whether it is working or not. Any other questions? Okay. All right, so let me introduce you to Jay. They only get more complex. Jay was in a developmental kindergarten in his home district. Excuse my language, Jay was a holy terror. So toward the end of the year, they tried to do a case study because he was approaching 6, and it was time for a label. And so I did not, but one of my peers went in, tried to do some testing with the speech and language person, came back. One of them ended up with a big black and blue mark for where they had been hit by Jay. And Jay's behavior was horrendous. So the hearing school that he was mainstreamed in basically said, it's because of his hearing loss. So now it is fall. We are all getting back. None of us knew that Jay was going to be in our program. Imagine our surprise. So not only did Jay move into our program, but a whole bunch of other kids moved into district and ended up in this class. And so the poor teacher, who is not in this room right now and actually is still on the front lines teaching today, ended up having 12 students in her class in a very small classroom because she planned this summer to have 7. And that, maybe 6. Anyway, so Jay was one of 12 students in a class that was expected to be. So we scrambled a lot. Let me tell you, those first couple of weeks were not fun. And Jay, who was not used to coming from his neighborhood school where he could skip and run to school, to being in a taxi cab that took him a good chunk of time, at least 40 minutes to get to school. So he was not happy being put in a seatbelt, being contained, or having to wake up early to be at school. Okay, further on Jay. Jay just had a lot of problems, and we had no clue. He would be one of those kids that the red, there are no antecedents sign would have been coming up. We could not figure it out. There was way too much. And for the other school to say, he doesn't belong here, send him to the school for the deaf because really, it's his hearing problems. Jay walked in with more colloquial phrases than you will find on your typical senior. Further, Jay would be on the swings. The kids he would most get along with were the other kids in the mainstream school, not our kids. When Jay didn't like what he was doing, he would get on a rampage, and I am not kidding you, but in this room, every single chair would have been piled up to the ceiling. He would have knocked it over 3 more times. There was not a person or thing in the beginning that made it easy for us to deal with Jay. So the first thing we did is we said we need more staff. 1 teacher and 1.5 classroom aides is not enough for 12 kids or 11 kids and Jay. So we ended up doing some scrambling, and really the first month of Jay was truly that. Our intervention team, the social worker, me, our intervention specialist, we were all spending most of our time in the classroom with Jay. At some point, more space was made available. Now this is a month in, 3 to 4 weeks into school. We got the school we were at to do some rearranging, and all of a sudden, we were able to set up a second classroom. Now, what do you need if you have a second classroom? You need furniture. Okay, got that. We were able to separate it out. We were able to get the books. We were able to separate that out. What am I major missing here? A teacher. Okay, so we found a lot of subs. What does that do to poor little Jay's class? He's having a different teacher every couple of days. Okay, for consistency, out the window. The only consistency was my team and I were always there. They're over here. You'll get to meet them later. Anyway, we were always spending time in Jay's class. We had a few other kids we needed to spend time with. We weren't finding that time. So there were tons of changes that went on, and what I'm about to show you here makes it look like, that was easy. Jay was just a piece of cake. I think some of us still have bruises from Jay. And God bless the teachers and the staff who are in that classroom, because here I was like the grandparent. I could come in, I could leave, you know. I didn't get to leave as much, but the reality is I had a different perspective because I could come and go. I wasn't waking up every morning going, I have to be in that class again. I don't have energy. You know, and besides that we all bring other concerns to school. You get a brand new teacher coming in the middle of a school year who hasn't had all summer to prepare for that classroom. She's not very happy. She's not very organized in the beginning. Even the world's best, most obsessive-compulsive teacher could not come into that classroom, hit the ground running. We had to put in other supports for Jay. Okay, without going into the details of all of Jay's program, this is the summary for Jay. And we tweaked this program. Jay, because he was getting up early, here are the things we had to do to set him up for success. He could not be left alone with his peers. Somebody had to be really close. We had to make sure that there were a whole bunch of activities that were very short. We went back to the preschool. He's a first grader. We went back to the preschool and got lots of wooden puzzles and foam puzzles and things that he could not destroy easily, but that would give him an opportunity to be doing something that looked like classwork initially, so the teacher could actually teach the rest of the kids. So there were number puzzles when it was math time, and there were alphabet puzzles when it was reading time. The other thing we found out is that Jay did need to have snacks, because Jay got hungry a lot. And initially, we thought he had a parasite. So we actually put into there that we would have to actually weigh him once a week to make sure that all the food we were giving him was actually, he wasn't gaining weight, because the last thing we needed to do. But he was asking for snacks a lot. And we couldn't tell if it was sensory or if really he was hungry, because he came from a family that had limited resources. And we didn't know certain times of the month whether or not he was getting enough food at home. He did not gain weight. So that was the next thing on there that we were looking at. We had to keep giving him and reminding staff to give him choices. This is the old, do you want to eat carrots or peas? You have to eat vegetable day. You know, so we would have to keep giving short choices. But he would say no to everything. So then the choice became, do you want to do it yourself or do you want me to help you? That became the choice. And I think that's a really important one to keep in your own repertoire, because sometimes, do you want to do activity A or activity B doesn't work? I'm telling you, you're doing activity A, you can either do it yourself or I can help you, becomes the choice. We provided lots of sensory breaks for him. We gave him as much notice that we were about to leave the room, come back to the room, whether we were going to change the class, the activity we were doing. We needed to give lots of, this is our 2-minute warning, this is our 1-minute warning, this is our 30-minute warning, our 30-second warning. We had to do a lot of that, especially leaving the playground. It got to the point where Jay stayed on the playground a lot longer because we just needed him to get all that physical stuff out, and we weren't going to take the jungle gym into the classroom with us. He had a lot of, the class already was on a PBIS system, and they were getting a lot of rewards. But for Jay, we were giving him even more rewards, and he had a secondary way of using things. And in fact, we had to start with, you can work, you can have a choice. And his choice was like a box of playthings he liked. He happened to like little figurines. This is, again, so typically a deaf kid. He would have whole dialogues, I say sarcastically, whole dialogues with the figurines, fighting it out. That would be his preferred activity. We could start within the first month to identify that there was no way that his hearing loss was the primary reason that his behavior was this way. But now we're into September, new classroom, end of September, October. It's almost getting close to Thanksgiving. Do you think it's easy to talk about bringing a kid back home when the school's like, is that coming to us? So we, in reality right now, are even discussing whether he should stay the rest of the school year or not. And that is an ongoing discussion, but it can't take away our time to discuss whether or not he is in our program right now, and we're trying to set him up for success. And then what's really important is he's one of those kids that we have an extensive person doesn't burn out, who's actually working with him directly. And we've also talked about making sure we rotate through other individuals so that it isn't all the responsibility of one staff. Because the last thing we really want to do is burn out that one staff, and we've already lost several staff in that room, and he's already had so many changes, so we don't want to be able to do more than that. The skills, we weren't sure he knew how to follow a schedule. He was very much on a self-directed schedule. And so what we ended up doing with him is the very simple, you do this first, and then you get to do this. And so for a lot of it, first, then, and then we'd repeat. First, then, all through every 20 minutes we were sort of switching that out. We did a lot of modeling of new skills for him. We tried to teach him how to play some simple games with his peers because the communication was definitely a problem. We actually used some social stories because he could follow and hear those stories over and over again on what the skills were that we wanted him to have. Did I just push that there? Okay. Ways that we found to help motivate him was having that free choice, having constantly, he really liked being praised. He liked it when he got, instead of stickers, because he would sort of destroy the stickers if he was frustrated, we took Lego blocks. No, not Lego blocks. Bigger. Duplo box, yeah. The real big ones. Is it Primo?
Yeah, the big.
And we put a line on the bulletin board or on the wall, and he would build his own tower. And when he would get to that, there was a little box of, as I call them, trash or tchotchkes, that he would just love. So everybody was like cleaning up their houses and finding all these little McDonald's toys to keep in that box. And when he got enough blocks, he could also go to that line. What people were really concerned about with that secondary reinforcement was what you had mentioned earlier. It's not fair. What about the other kids? The other kids were so happy to have their teacher's attention and quiet in the class. They didn't care that he had all those things because they were on their PBIS routine and they got to go to the treasure box every week with their tickets to redeem their stuff. They didn't need it. And so while the teacher was worried that it wasn't going to be fair, the kids satiated to it really quickly. I think within the first week of the blocks going up and the good behavior being at the top of it, it was not an issue. I think we were more concerned on being fair parents to that class. What they wanted was a teacher who could attend to what their needs were. And their needs were they wanted to learn. So I think that was a really interesting thing to see, that we were all worried that he was getting more reinforcers. And then we put in this whole crisis prevention and how we had to keep him safe and how we had to keep the other kids safe. He was a biter. And what we ended up having to do, as horrible as it is, we had to tell staff to put on dishwashing rubber gloves because it was a visual reminder and he did not like to see staff actually wearing those to escort him out to the bus. Because what we were finding is once he got into the routine of the day, putting him back on the cab to send him home was horrible. He'd be like one of those kids, you know, like arms all the way outstretched, refusing to get in the cab, and anybody who would use any physical touch with him would get bitten. And, you know, trying to put a seatbelt on, you can't avoid being close to a kid when you try to put a seatbelt on. I haven't figured out remote control, how to put a seatbelt on a kid. So we had to be close. We had no choice. We also had a lot of training to make sure that the staff knew proper techniques to how to handle him. And so, in fact, we in the October, November, when did we start doing CPI all over again? October. So we knew that we brought in, and everybody had a training day, an in-service day, and we changed the topic of the in-service day and gave everybody a refresher course on crisis prevention, intervention techniques, and how to de-escalate things and how to have the right stance and how to hold him and what we could do and what we couldn't do. So he is still a tough kid. Here's the problem that we found with him. Just like with Annie, there were too many people. We had to check that the program was really going on, that we were really doing what we said on paper we were going to be doing. So in the beginning, we had a member of the intervention team in that classroom daily. We moved to 2 to 4 times a week. We were reviewing the data every 10 days because what I was hearing from staff was, it's not working, we need something else. It didn't work. The magic wand just wouldn't work. We started making small changes, and we really were there to reassure people that they were doing what we wanted them to do, and at first, behavior gets worse before it gets better. and that they were doing everything right. And that was our biggest role, was to be in there just saying, keep going, keep going, keep going. Yep, we know it's hard. Nope, we don't have an option. Keep going. And we were making, the only changes that we readily did is we changed all the little goodies that were in the reinforcement box because he was getting tired of the same kind of characters. We also took out fewer choices. We didn't let him have 6 choices. There was one thing, so we hoped that he would get tired of his free choice and come back to the classroom. So here's actually his data. So you'll notice that also the data wasn't consistent. So the number of actual days that we had to divide the daily, we did monthly averages. So we counted up everything that happened in the month. And then we divided it by the number that's in parentheses there, because that's the number of actual days, not calendar days, but actual days that we had data. And so one month it was 7, and one month it was 15, and if we had all divided it all by 30, we wouldn't have had averages that really made sense. So following directions went up. Participating in group activities went up. Now, these aren't daily averages, I'm sorry to say, these are monthly averages. And participating in academic-related lessons went up. We were happy to see that refusing to work, that no, 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 was going down. It was not non-existent. It still is not non-existent. We would like to have seen that better. Destroying materials. We started to see a really nice drop, and then right around Thanksgiving break, the couple of days right before the kids were leaving, all of a sudden we saw a huge leap in destroying things to take home. We don't really understand why. We could all speculate on some things, but we don't really have an understanding of why that was occurring. And then physical aggression toward adults was going down, and physical aggression toward peers sort of went down, and then it went back up. So here's one more piece of data. What was the actual physical aggression that was going on? And I think this is another thing, that when you group things in here, sometimes we needed to pull it further apart. So in September, we were having a lot more monthly incidences of biting, pulling hair, and kicking, and a lot of hitting. What we weren't seeing is sort of that swatting at somebody, like not really intending on hitting, but definitely aggressive. Pushing, and what we weren't seeing a lot of was those air fists. Look at what ended up happening. The significant physical aggression went down. He wasn't biting anymore, thank goodness. He wasn't pulling hair anymore, thank goodness. Kicking had gone down, it wasn't completely eliminated. Hitting was down, it wasn't completely, but we were seeing a lot more swatting and a lot more air fists. He was still frustrated, but he had internalized what the structure of that classroom was, and he knew that he could not get away with, no one would let him hit other people and hurt other people. So when we looked at it, this makes it even seem like, oh, so those are the type of behaviors everybody on the staff could tolerate that. We would like to see those numbers going down still, but they weren't as bad. Yeah.
How much cooperation did you get from the staff in terms of the data collection?
The 2 staff that rotated back and forth from providing him direct one-on-one service was relieved to have the time to be the data collector. I got lots of cooperation because it meant that they actually had some respite. That helped. They also were responsible for developing the format to do it. I have found personally that when I bring in tracking sheets and I say, here you go, it gets thrown somewhere. Where did I put that? When I say, email me what you want to use or leave me a copy, all of a sudden I see a little bit more. And in fact, the actual tally sheet that was being used was changed by the aides, but they couldn't make it look nice, so they gave it back to me and said, make this a prettier form and give it back to us. So that was where we ended up going. So that was my only involvement in actually developing that form. So I had to find what was motivating to the staff, and the idea that they could actually just be tracking data unless there was a time where 2 people were needed to work with this kid, 2 on 1, that they were happy to be. Whew. Now we have one other kid who's in our preschool right now that just the mere fact of the data sheet showing up and somebody with a clipboard walking into the room doing this, his behavior has totally gotten better. I digress, it's not Jay. But it's pretty funny because I'll be in a meeting and the staff will say to me, could you bring your clipboard to our room for a little bit this morning? So, I mean, it's sort of interesting. The kids are also getting used to seeing that. And in fact, with Jay, if he did something that was really bad, he'd try to take the pencil away. Don't write it down, don't write it down. So he even knew that, that block, that wall of blocks wasn't going to happen, plus somebody was writing it down. So he had enough awareness about that.
How old is Jay and how much family involvement?
Jay is pretty young. He's a first grader. Mom did not believe that it was his hearing loss. Mom was the only one at the IEP meeting that said, no, that's a wrong placement. And she didn't have she either didn't want to or didn't understand due process. And so I was going to say, sort of agreed reluctantly to send him and hasn't been real happy with what they were hearing. See, I told you, I knew it wasn't right, and that's what we're getting. So Mom is sort of resigned to what's going on and not really involved. I mean, there's a lot more socially that I could tell you, but I won't. But I mean, to say that, no, Mom's not very involved, and there isn't a dad figure around. Yes, Annie's mom, if we could clone her, besides that she's a little over-involved, we would all be happy. Yes. Jay's mom is more typically what we see. Whew, you have him. You figure it out. Just don't call me and bring him home till that bus is supposed to be home.
With older students, when you go in to write down, they know exactly who you're watching. And it's been my experience that they will test you. I mean, they want to do more to see how much they can get away with because you're not actually
stopping them.
It's stopping them. So when the teacher turns around, they will be flicking people off. And now it's become just totally crazy because they know that you're in there watching them.
One of the things that when I go in, I never just observe one student. So I am always looking at that student, that target student with at least 1 or 2 peers. And I'm also not just looking at the negative behaviors. I'm looking at the positive behaviors. With one student who's in our upper elementary school, we actually gave him, when he was doing well, we actually gave him a card that he'd go and put into a folder to use that he was doing good. So he was part of it. Other kids, I've actually had them graph their own data. Just like you would do with a math test or a spelling test and the results. And actually, if they're that aware, I'll actually have them part of the data collection. And then we'll talk about, oh, see, here's our goal line. We want this over here, or we want it down here. Oh, you went over it. What can we do? And sometimes kids who already know about it, putting them involved, really it helps. Because then they're part of the team instead of the target. And sometimes that helps. Not always. Anybody else?
I just have a question about during this time, when you're trying to, lower this behavior of biting and hair pulling and all that, what happens when he did bite? I mean, I realize he was getting blocks, for good behavior and that type of thing. But what happens on that off day when, he's trying to communicate something and they're not getting it and he does bite? I mean, what?
Only on one. The question was about what actually happened when he bit. There was a whole procedure. Basically, we were using crisis prevention, and he would be removed from the immediate situation into a timeout kind of a thing. One of the things that we ended up creating in this classroom was his office, which is basically a timeout space, for him to go to. And he would not be permitted to be with the other kids. Sometimes we had to physically remove him from the classroom. One time we took him to the principal's office. One time we took him to the nurse's office. Most of the time, just removing him was enough. Like we could just get to barely outside the door. Terry, can you remember any other times when he actually bit? What we did with him, or Cheryl? We took him to the principal when he bit the other student. When he bit staff, I think he was just removed. Timeouts. Okay.
What, you said that getting in the cab was a bad time. So you get the rubber gloves on, and if he bites the aide who's putting him in the cab, you can't take him to timeout when the cab's sitting there waiting.
That was a problem, but I think there was only one time, once the gloves came out, he bit somebody getting into the cab, but once the gloves were there, he didn't like the taste of the gloves. So after the gloves showed up, and in fact on bad days in the classroom, all the one aide would do is put one glove on and he would stop because he didn't like the taste of whether it was the latex or the rubber, I don't remember, but he didn't like the taste of it when he tried. And it was those big gloves so that nobody, he hasn't yet bitten through the gloves, right. So the taste of it was enough of an aversive stimuli that he hadn't tried to bite anybody once they had the gloves on. And so we didn't have to worry about that part.
If you were putting him on the cab and he was upset, that was a 40-minute ride, not, that was a day, it wasn't.
The question was, you put him on the cab upset. You know, sometimes we don't do things that are exactly the best. But I can say that he calmed down pretty quick when he felt like he had won his battle. So when we figured out that there was something about going home, the cab driver initially said no additional things in his hand, you know, like all things have to be under the seat, in the trunk, whatever. We got certain things to let the driver, and we had transition objects basically that he took. And so for the month of October, he was taking a lot of magazines and pictures and things in the car with him, and that seemed to calm him down a bit. Do you remember any of the other things that we used with him to go home on the bus?
Well, we knew the transition was hard too, so we started going out when the rest of the group.
Ah, yes. I think that's on here. We actually did start much earlier, thank you, much earlier starting. So let's say if it was 3:20 that the buses would be there, at 2 to 3 we would start saying, okay, you're doing really well, here's your positive reinforcer, you've been doing good, you can pick something, let's get your backpack done, let's go to the bathroom. And when the weather was sort of nice, he was actually given an opportunity to go to the playground in that few minutes ahead of time to let off some steam, and that seemed to also work. So we were taking him before the rest of, thank you, that's the other thing that we were doing with that. Other questions? So, what did we learn from this? It took a lot of our time. I threatened to walk around for Halloween as a firefighter because I felt like September and October, all I was doing was putting out fires. I never had gotten to my desk. I didn't get reports or phone calls returned. I was just putting out little J fires all over the place. We also had a couple of other kids at this time in our program that were also in the red zone. So we didn't have all of our time just to do that. So we really did find a way to try to do the observations. There would be times in the beginning that I would actually watch how staff were filling out, how they were coding the data sheets to make sure that they were really filling them out what we would say was consistently. They were doing every 15 minutes. The tracking sheets were every 15, grids that had the opportunity for every 15 minutes. We came back and checked how the plan was working. We were doing the data every month, every week, looking at it, and that we met a lot initially. Besides, you know, I told you all those extra meetings before school, after school. After school only worked in one situation. Most of the staff were too exhausted to stay and preferred to start out their day. People didn't want to do it too much over lunch, although our program supervisor, that would be the first default to get everybody at a lunch meeting, and people felt like they needed some time to digest their food and not think about Jay and the rest of the students. So before school became our more preferred time to meet, or having other people. At one point, we thought about bringing a sub in so the teacher and the aide could come out, and then we're like, are we crazy? One more change? No, that didn't work for very long. We only did that once. Anything else you guys can think of that we did with him that I haven't mentioned? Okay. All right, but this is the thing that I just wanted to make sure that we haven't given up on Jay. While we all disagree that this is the right place for him to be, we're not giving up on him. We're trying very hard to give him the supports, and we are seeing that behavior has gotten better. We are actually seeing, one of the things that the teacher has found is that some of those same behavior strategies we're using with all the kids. So for example, during free reading period, we want to make sure that none of the kids can actually get a fist to each other, because that's also the time at free reading period in the morning that all those hearing aids and assistive listening devices are being checked. So the kids have hula hoops. They can pick a pillow to take with them to the hula hoop, but the hula hoops are spread out enough that they're to be sitting on the floor, not actually hula hoops around their waist, but on the floor, defining their space, so that we could move it out to the hall if we needed to or whatever. So that has worked for the whole class. Other strategies that have worked for the whole class was putting a tape line where their desks should actually be. And if it slides off, some visual reminders in that regard. The teacher's gone a little crazy with all the different places that it's taped off, and you can be here but not here, but anyway, we've sort of worked out that whole, going back to that first example of the classroom, we spent a lot of time sort of figuring out what the classroom environment should look like. So.
In that class too, it was very important to really be watching our PBIS stuff. There was just needed to be more positives for everybody, not just Jay, and that helped everybody, including Jay.
Yeah, Terry reminds me very much so that having the PBIS lesson, more positives to, lots of reinforcement, both the little PBIS tickets as well as the verbal praise really had worked with everybody. The other kids really wanted to be told they were doing good. They didn't care that their behavior wasn't as bad as Jay's, but they wanted to be caught being good. And some of the kids would do all sorts of stuff, and then when they were recognized, their behaviors even got less. That whole idea of the PBIS model was really working for them. So when we come back from lunch, we're going to go through an actual example. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I know. I'm just explaining. I'll get there. Okay. Sherry's worried I'm going to give you too much time. Yeah. Lunch won't be ready, but I'm planning this. You have them have an assignment. All right, so what we're going to do when we come back is actually role play an entire situation of problem solving with a very difficult high school student. We decided that if we were going to role play enough of these elementary school kids, Jay is big enough that I can actually take him down if I have to, which I'm not supposed to do, but I could.